Pandemic is unthinkable without the notion of place. Every account of the Black Death in Europe, which arrived in 1347, is accompanied by speculation about its origin. Far in the east, hard by China, say contemporary chronicles. HIV/AIDS arrived in the West with an anxious discourse about its supposed origin in Africa. Trump has only exposed the xenophobic logic of plague discourse by insisting on calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus. Pandemic is unthinkable without the notion of place. But in a fundamental sense, pandemic is unthinkable. It exceeds the distinctions that usually regularize the world for us. It collapses the boundaries between me and the many others that constitute my vision of the world. That is partly why a panic about origins arises during pandemic. It becomes crucial to create an origin so that all space does not become intolerably heterogeneous and multiple. Pandemic is unthinkable without the notion of place. But then place is unthinkable in pandemic. It becomes a matter of all peoples, pan demos. The world becomes a space of panic. Pan, the god of the forest, whose cry summoned up terror in the people of the city, the cry of savage nature which threatens the apocalypse, the excess, the unveiling of the all. Plato's Crotylus says, the logos reveals all things, to pan. Pan-ik, the provocation to representation, is the return of a divinity shut out from the world, the return of a presence from before the seculum, the secularized world in which we live now. Even in the religious Middle Ages, the panic of pandemic threatened a confidence in cosmological order. In a remarkable account, remarkable because it so clearly anticipates what we all are doing at this moment, the great 14th century poet French poet Guillaume de Machaut describes how one November in 1349, during the Black Death, he took shelter in his room, mais tenui à couvert, solitary in both room and mind. Tous seuls en ma chambre et pensais. Like melancholy lovers in the Middle Ages, he suffers because he is isolated from any and all love objects. But what is most horrible for him, he says, is that now few people reverence God. There is no longer order, and everyone has become the site of their own ruin. Chacun se perd. Yet there is still further ruination. The mind, which in medieval psychological tradition can bring recuperation from the resources of memory, is incapable of making sense of the collapse of the world. The pandemic exceeds the resources of representation. It is so unlike anything else that there can be no memory of it. Dont homme peut avoir mémoire, says Machaut, nor can there be any record in historical texts. Car je ne trouve pas en histoire lisant nulles si merveilleuses. Trained on the text of Machaut, Geoffrey Chaucer, the most important poet of medieval England, thematizes the gap between the capacity to make order and the unconscious acknowledgement that we live in the ruins of the world in his chivalric romance, The Knight's Tale. The poem ends with a triumphant speech given by Theseus, the king of Athens, outside of which lies the grove of Pan, that celebrates the order that Jove, chief of Roman gods and Chaucer's proxy for the Christian God, guarantees in every world event. The universe is totally orderly, totally lucid and legible. But Theseus is wrong. The world in the poem is governed not by Jove, but by Saturn. He is the god of ruination, the father of pestilence, the poem says. But no one in the world of the poem knows this. This not knowing is the unconscious of the plague, its crypt that seals off the unbearable truth of catastrophe from the living. We only glimpse the truth through the cracks in language. Guillaume de Machaut is exceptional, Geoffrey Chaucer is not. Machaut is exceptional because he writes directly about the plague. Chaucer is typical. Like almost all writers in the wake of the plague, he writes about it only indirectly. I would say he writes about it cryptically. Like writers for almost 40 years after the Black Death, he refers to it in a way that seals off or looks away from the extent of the horror, as if it is still unrepresentable. And it is. Even allegory, the usual recourse for medieval explanation, dramatizes its own collapse. Another poem by Chaucer, The Pardoner's Tale, dramatizes a search by three young men for death with a capital D, the term by which the medieval English called plague, the death, as if allegory, signaled by capitalization, could somehow do what the mere term death could not do. What is remarkable and devastating is that these men cannot understand that capital D, death, and death cannot be apprehended, grasped, compris, begriffen in body or in concept. The festival morbidity that we, that is, Huizinga, Ariel, Benjamin, associate with the Middle Ages only emerged when the catastrophe had become distant enough to be approximated by representation. The figure of the archive replaced the crypt. We no longer have the confidence that we can understand death, but we can record our preoccupation with it. A failure to grasp the quality of death is replaced by the initiative to calculate its extent, to record in quantitative, even sociological terms, the entirety of its domain. Paris began the initiative. During the course of just the first wave of the Black Death in Paris, up to 500 corpses were carried every day to the burial ground of the Church of the Holy Innocents, the Cimetière des Innocents. It was so full by the end of the 14th century that buildings were erected around the cemetery to hold bones disinterred to make room for fresher corpses in the ground. These bones were arranged in visible stacks, the skulls often looking outward through apertures in the walls and roof. The bodies of the dead, in short, were exhibited. This exhibition of the dead enabled a new representational resource, the archive, the public demonstration of the presence of death. The most celebrated work of art at the Church of the Holy Innocents was the first known dance of death, the Danse Macabre. Painted along the southern wall of the arcade around the cemetery, the Danse Macabre included a representation of members of every social rank, from Pope, Emperor, and King to peasant, child, and hermit. The mural was a record, an archive of the totality of death, or at least an attempt to represent it. Shortly before the mural was painted around 1424, Jean Gerson, the Chancellor of the University of Paris, composed a treatise that acknowledged the social magnitude of death and the necessity of preparing for it, the first Ars Moriendi, the art of death. Its immediate popularity throughout Europe created a genre of writing, indeed a mode of writing, that inscribed the ubiquity of death and its social effects. Death began to be imagined as a social relation, something to be grasped within the archive, the site of communal memory, and the outward representation of the arts of rule. Death, in other words, became public. Yet the history of modernity in the West, we are told, is a history of the invention of privacy, of forbidden death. And modernity is bound up with mortality, the radical conviction of finitude. Mortality becomes one's ownmost, something no one else can experience for you, the guarantor of your radical contingency, but also of the absolute totality of subjectivity. Yet this privacy is being challenged by this pandemic. On the one hand, we have the radical isolation of the self, or at least in theory, especially in the experience of death. No one is there with a dying person. No one is there with a mourner. Hundreds of people have died on their own. Relatives and lovers can only watch from a distance on their phones and laptops. Those left behind cannot touch the body, cannot embrace each other, and often cannot even attend a burial. Yet this experience itself must not necessarily be an endless mourning, a hecatomb of signs. In pandemic, I am the death of the other. This awful retreat from community and the logics of sociality means the embrace of a sociality we cannot literally embrace. It means looking into the heart of privacy and finding there a commitment to a relation beyond the death of the other. It means sustaining an idea of a relation that is still to come. The avoidance of that relation is clear in the so-called libertarian protests against lockdown orders, the calls for liberation. That kind of freedom means an embrace of finitude, a finitude of community, a finitude of suffering, a finitude of care for the other. especially when I am the death of the other. The protest against isolation is the ruin of community, exposing one of the contradictions of, if not capital, then the construction of bourgeois subjectivity. As the 15th century discovered, we must embrace the death of the other. We must recognize that we are the death of the other. We must allow finitude to extend itself into the world again. We must rediscover that public death exists, and that we must find a language and a concept for it again, beyond the radical certainty of our own finitude. What we in the West have lost since the Middle Ages may be the experience of death as a social phenomenon. Compared with Ghana, where funerals last a week, the West's rituals of mourning are subdued and intimate. But in the last several months, they have become too intimate. No one is there with a dying person. No one is there with a mourner. To mourn publicly, together with other people, is, right now, also to extend the grip of death by infecting other people. What we need to do is to embrace the possibility of human relation without being able to experience it now, directly. Cryptic writing supposes that there is a place of recognition or final revelation, although it is barred or restricted from us. The literature of the archive acknowledges the absence of place. It stands in for absence, but not absolutely. It also inscribes absence, if only simply because it is inscription. In this pandemic, we cannot take up a relation with place, because the production of social relations by place and in place has disappeared. It is precisely space that is evacuated. But the impossibility of finding relation in place is the very subject of archival writing. In the Steps of Hegel, Blanchot and the English philosopher Julian Rose after him imagined that literature is the work of relating to a relation, and in this work inheres a possible order. It is a work that demands a care for language, for representation, but above all for living relationships. What we can imagine is how to remake an invisible community out of the people who are isolated from each other in places sealed off, just as houses were during the Black Death, but isolated precisely so that we can and do care for each other in the future.